seemingly delayed. A UK-owned company, Wind Prospect, wanted to build 90 turbines. Each would be about 265 metres tall, which is almost as tall as the Crown in Barangaroo. But almost every week it feels like we're seeing a renewable energy project being cancelled or delayed. Now, this presents a challenge for our country because Labor wants our grid to be 82% renewable by 2030 and ultimately net zero by 2050. Is this even possible? What are the trade-offs? And will the hundreds of billions of dollars we have to spend really make a difference to global emissions? Well, joining me now to debate these issues is Jude Blick, Senior Energy Analyst at the CIS, and Chris O'Keefe, former 2GB presenter and now spokesman for the Clean Energy Council. Chris, thanks so much for joining us. Let's start with you. Do you think net zero is actually achievable?
It is achievable, and firstly, it's 25 years away. That's a very long period of time between 2025 and 2050. To put it in perspective, YouTube was in a very embryonic stage all the way back in 2005. The iPhone, Twitter, all of it was sort of some weird technological development that may or may not be sort of mainstream. And we're in a situation now where in 25 years' time, the path that we're setting on now in terms of decarbonising the grid is the path that we should be setting on, and it's the path that we've certainly got in place. And technology will change, and I think it's pretty clear that the world is on a path to net zero, and it's, plenty of capital behind it, plenty of will behind it, and plenty of political will behind it too, and I think we'll certainly get there.
Jude, what are your thoughts? Is net zero possible?
Absolutely not. No, this technological optimism for the next 25 years is not paying off so far, and it won't. Noting that even in 2019, Kane Thornton, the previous chief executive of the Clean Energy Council, said that renewables didn't need any subsidies anymore, as the technology had gotten good enough and cheap enough to make that the case. And so that's 6 years ago. They still need subsidies. There are virtually no new wind and solar projects going ahead without subsidies. And look, net zero relies on cheap electricity. There's three major sectors of our society to decarbonise. We've got to get the electricity grid, then we've got to get all the petrol and diesel use decarbonised, and then there's the hard to abate stuff that we think we're going to use hydrogen for. And look, electrification and hydrogenification requires cheap electricity, and that is now abundantly clear that wind and solar do not produce cheap electricity. We've already slipped in the ranks in the OECD cheapest power rankings from 7th place out of the 36, so front of the pack, down to 28th place out of 36, right at the back of the pack in terms of cheapest power. So I think that's becoming even more clear as we go.
Chris, what do you make of Jude's comments, and how much do you think net zero will cost us?
Well, what's the alternative? Has Jude got an alternative for us? Because we're in a situation where 90% of the East Coast's coal-fired power stations have done a wonderful job for Australia over a really long period of time, but we've got to change the kit. They're getting old. Just look at your lawn, right? Your lawn in Victoria. They had a pretty significant outage last year, and it wasn't just one outage, 4,000 hours of outages. You know what that means? Your lawn, coal-fired power station, is not feeding electricity into the grid, and what do you think that does to your power bills? Up it goes. So we need to replace the kit, and what are we going to replace it with? And I think it's a little bit tried of people like Jude and those on the anti-net zero train to effectively just stand on the sidelines and poke holes in what is a transition that the entire country is behind, the entire world is behind, without offering a feasible alternative. What is it? We're going to build new coal-fired power stations. We tried that. There was a feasibility study in Collinsville for far north Queensland. That was $5 million that Scott Morrison, as Prime Minister, put towards a feasibility study when they knew full well it was not feasible to build new coal-fired power stations in Australia. We went down the nuclear path. 94 seats in the House of Representatives. Australia said no to nuclear power, and even if they did say yes to nuclear power, it'll still be 15, 20 years away. So what is the answer to replace the coal-fired electricity that is retiring because the kit is old? What are we going to replace it with? The only thing that we can replace it with is the technology that exists now, and that is solar, that is wind, that is big batteries, and that is pumped hydro, and a bit of gas at the end to firm it all up. Now, that's the electricity system we're building. 70-odd% last week of the national electricity market was powered by renewable energy. We're on the path here. We can try to wreck it as much as we want and poke holes in it as much as we want, but at the end of the day, this is what we're doing, and realistically, unless you can provide an alternative, all you're doing is just being a critic.
Jude, what do you say to that?
Well, first note that the whole world is not on board with this energy transition. Some of the world's largest emitters, China, India, the US, are not decarbonising at anywhere near the rate that we are trying to, and not on board with that at all. And Australia represents less than 1% of the world's emissions, so it doesn't make sense for us to...
Don't try, don't bother about it. So you're saying?
Well, I'm open to the argument that we should reduce emissions in line with what some of the bigger emitters are doing. But if we're less than 1% of the world's emissions and we're sacrificing our industrial capability and our cheap power advantage in our way of life on the altar of this net zero fanatical goal, I don't think that's worthwhile. If Australia dropped off the map tomorrow, we would not have an impact on the climate. And so I'm open to that argument. But you've mentioned that the coal fleet is ageing and what the alternative would be. And it goes back to that argument that, look, we've been told that we've got to decarbonise at any cost because, if we don't, the world's going to end or something like that. And I reject that argument. You can't say we don't have any other option.
Coal-fired power?
Yeah, I think more coal-fired power. And look, you've picked an example of your lawn, which is one of the oldest power stations, and there's no denying that the coal fleet is ageing. But Queensland's coal-fired power generation is some of the youngest in the country. Three power stations are less than 25 years old. The CEO of Delta Electricity has recently stated publicly that he's upgrading his equipment with 10-plus year lifetime upgrades because he knows that coal is going to be around for longer than what the system planners have planned for the decrease in coal usage. And so, I think either serious refurbishment, or new coal-fired power stations until we can get to something like nuclear to provide that baseload power is the right path here, and it's the most sensible.
But Chris, is coal really the most expensive, or are people not investing in it because they've been told repeatedly over and over by the government that coal is being phased out, there's no place for new coal? Isn't that the real reason why at the moment it might look like coal is not feasible?
Well, there's no law against building a new coal-fired power station or proposing one or putting one through an approval process. Nothing. There's nothing stopping the private sector, and last time I checked, it's a capitalist society and free markets are important, and guess what? The free markets have been pretty clear that coal-fired power stations are, one, not financially viable, and two, they're not in the interests of these private companies and private capital to build them. So, either we believe in free markets or we don't. And that's kind of a curious part of Peter Dutton's point. And I'll just raise you talk about China. Well, in April, China built as much solar capacity in 1 month in April as Australia has done in its entire history in 1 month. Do you think the Chinese Communist Party is doing it so it can sit around the table at the UN and sing Kumbaya? Or are they doing it because it's extraordinarily cheap and it's a nationally important thing to do? This is what the Chinese government is doing, and what we're sitting here going, maybe not. The world is moving on, and either Australia gets on board or it doesn't, and we certainly have. Again, 70-odd% of Australia's energy generation last week was from renewable energy. This stuff works. It works. It's working right now. Every time you flick the switch on, every time you turn your computer on, every time you turn your telly on to watch Freya Leach on Sky News, it's being generated, it's being lit up by electrons that are powered by renewable energy. And that is not a bad thing. And we're in a situation now where Australia is moving that way, the world is moving that way, and we talk about China and all the rest of it. Mate, the Chinese are some of the world leaders in building renewable energy capacity. Again, they're doing it because it is really cheap for them, and they realise that if they're not importing fuels across the strait, then it gives them a major national security advantage. And also, guess what? It works. It powers their economy, and it reduces a major amount of pollution in their capital cities.
Jude, your thoughts on that?
First thing I'd say is that the Chinese investment might be large, but they don't have the net zero goal that we do. And look, the complicated thing about renewables is that they do work at small percentages of the grid, while you have the base load dispatchable power capacity that can actually back them up, because solar only produces power 25% of the time, and wind only roughly 30% of the time. And so they work up to roughly 20% of the grid, which is what China is kind of getting to. But once you get beyond that, every country around the world which has tried to go a renewables penetration percentage greater than 30% has ended up with higher power prices.
That's not true. Uruguay has got 98% of their grid. Uruguay's got 98% of their grid renewables.
Every country
power
around the
bills
world
in
has tried
Australia.
it.
Cheaper power bills in Australia. Uruguay.
You mentioned free markets, and look, my only comment on free markets is if the free market was working here, we wouldn't have any need for subsidies. But even with a major subsidies, the capacity investment scheme just being rolled out, we're seeing uptake of these projects at less than 1/3 of the pace. That's a Clean Energy Council report. Less than 1/3 of the pace that we require to meet that 82% by 2030. So if you believe in free markets, why the subsidies?
Thank you so much, guys. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have. We could extend this to a 12-hour debate and it would still be awesome. Chris O'Keefe and Jude Blick, thank you so much for coming on. Well, coming up after the break, the head of Turning Point Australia, Joel Jamal, will join us to share his reflections on Charlie Kirk.